1st century AD. A Roman legionary field surgeon kneels over a soldier whose thigh has been laid open by a gladius. The wound is deep, the blood is coming fast, and the man's life is measured now in minutes. But the surgeon does not reach for anything we would recognize as medicine. He reaches instead for a handful of crushed leaves, the feathery foliage of a roadside weed, the kind that grows in every ditch from Britain to the edge of the empire. He presses the green pulp into the open wound, and the bleeding slows. This is not a story about luck. The plant in his hands has a name, and the Romans knew it well. Achillea millefolium, yarrow. A wild, unremarkable weed with flat clusters of small white flowers and leaves so finely divided they look almost like green feathers. Millefolium, the thousand leaf. To us, it is the sort of thing you'd walk past without a second glance. To the legions, it was something else entirely. They called it herba militaris, the military herb, a plant carried into battle as deliberately as a sword or a length of bandage, because it did a job no soldier could afford to be without. It stopped men from bleeding to death. Look closely at the genus name and the story reaches back further still, past Rome into legend. Achillea. It honors Achilles, the hero of Troy. According to Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist whose encyclopedia preserved so much of the ancient world's knowledge, Achilles learned the use of this very plant from the centaur Chiron, the wise tutor of heroes, half man and half horse, who schooled him in the healing arts. And what Achilles supposedly did with that knowledge was simple and practical. He pressed the crushed leaves into the wounds of his men on the fields outside Troy. But before we cross the Atlantic to the Civil War wards, let me pause on one thing. If you find yourself leaning in here, if a story like this, traced through old field manuals and pharmacopoeias rather than headlines, is the kind of thing you've been missing, then consider subscribing and leave a like. That's the entire reason this channel exists, to dig these forgotten remedies out of the historical record, one plant at a time. The more of us asking these questions, the more we recover. Now, back to that blockade and the manual that kept yarrow alive. The plant, in other words, was already tied to the battlefield before history could properly record it. By the time the Romans gave it a Latin name, they were not inventing a use, they were inheriting one. And here is the claim this whole story rests on. For roughly 2,000 years, soldiers carried this same wild plant into battle to stop hemorrhage. Not a different plant in each era, not a new discovery in every century. The same weed, the same feathery leaves, crushed into the same green paste, pressed into wounds by men who could not afford to be wrong about what worked. From the armies of antiquity onward, yarrow traveled with the people most likely to bleed, and most desperate for something that would make the bleeding stop. You can trace that unbroken thread in the names people gave it. Long after Rome fell, the plant kept its reputation, and ordinary folk in medieval Europe named it for what it did. They called it soldier's woundwort, the wound plant of fighting men. They called it staunch grass, the grass that staunches, that stems the flow of blood. And in cottages far from any battlefield, where the same plant was pressed into service for ordinary household injuries, they called it simply nosebleed. Each of these names is a fossil, a small, fossilized memory of a use that was once so common it needed no explanation. People did not name this weed for its flowers or its scent. They named it for the blood it stopped. So what was actually happening in that wound? The old records could only hint at the mechanism. They saw the result without the chemistry. But modern analysis has filled in what they could not. Yarrow contains an alkaloid called achilline, named, fittingly, for Achilles himself, and it appears to help the blood clot more quickly. Alongside it sit astringent tannins, compounds that contract and tighten torn tissue, drawing the edges of a wound together and slowing the seep of blood. And as if that weren't enough, the plant carries anti-inflammatory compounds that calm the angry, swollen tissue around an injury. 3 effects working together, one to clot, one to tighten, one to soothe. The legionary surgeon did not know the names of any of these molecules. He only knew that the leaves worked. The chemistry was simply explaining, centuries later, why. And this is the part to hold on to, because it is the spine of everything that follows. The records show it worked. This is not folklore. It is not a charming old wives' tale dressed up as history. It is documented battlefield practice, written down by naturalists, named in the languages of the people who used it, carried in the standard kit of professional armies across 2 millennia. A remedy does not survive 2,000 years of war by accident. Soldiers are ruthless about what they carry. Anything useless gets dropped within a generation. Yarrow was not dropped. It was trusted. Trusted with the single highest stakes decision a wounded man's life can present, whether the bleeding stops or whether it doesn't. Which leaves us with a question that should be quietly unsettling. If a common roadside weed reliably stopped battlefield bleeding for 2,000 years, if the records show it worked, again and again, across empires and centuries and continents, then where did it go? Why is it not in a single modern surgical kit? Why does almost no one alive today even know its name? Something that proven does not simply vanish without a reason. And the reason, it turns out, is stranger than the story so far. 2,000 years after that Roman surgeon knelt in the dirt, on a different continent and a different war, a Confederate medic reaches into his kit, pulls out a fistful of feathery leaves, and begins to crush them into a paste. He has never read Pliny. He has never heard the name Achilles. But the green smear forming under his thumb is the same one a legionary would have recognized on sight. The same plant, the same purpose, the same blood it was meant to stop. To understand how that weed ended up in his hands, you have to understand what was missing from it. By 1862, the Union blockade had closed the southern coastline like a fist. Federal warships sat off every major port, and the medicines a wartime army depends on simply stopped arriving. Morphine for pain, quinine for the fevers that killed as many men as bullets. These were manufactured in the North or imported from Europe, and the American Civil War had cut the Confederacy off from both. Surgeons in gray watched their supply chests run dry while the wounded kept coming. They needed something, and the something had to grow in the fields they already stood in. This is where the story stops being folklore and becomes a matter of official record. In 1863, a physician and botanist named Francis Porcher published a book with a plain, almost bureaucratic title, Resources of the Southern Fields and Forests. It was not a hobbyist's pamphlet. It had been commissioned by the Confederate Surgeon General himself, an order from the top of the medical command, to catalog every native plant the South could use in place of the supplies the blockade had taken away. Porcher walked through the forests, the ditches, the roadsides, and he wrote down what each plant could do and how to prepare it. It was a survival manual for an entire medical corps, and in its pages, yarrow appears by name. Not as a curiosity, not as a country superstition passed between grandmothers. Porcher lists it explicitly as a battlefield styptic, an agent to stop bleeding, sanctioned in print in wartime by the medical authority of a nation at arms. Think about what that means. This was an official instruction to army surgeons, telling them that when the morphine and the quinine were gone, this roadside weed would help hold a wounded man together. The folk knowledge the Romans carried for 2,000 years had been written into the formal doctrine of a modern fighting force. So the surgeons used it. Walk the wards in your mind. Picture the field hospitals behind the lines at Chickamauga, where the casualties came in faster than the tables could be cleared. Picture Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, more than 20,000 men fallen between dawn and dusk. The shrapnel wounds from artillery were ragged, deep, pouring. And in those tents, surgeons reached for poultices of yarrow, packing the crushed green pulp directly into torn flesh to slow the hemorrhage long enough to work. The astringent leaves drew the tissue tight. The bleeding eased. A man who would have died on the table got a chance to live. Now hold those two images side by side. A Roman field surgeon in the 1st century pressing crushed leaves into a sword wound at the edge of an empire. A Confederate medic in 1863 pressing the same crushed leaves into a shrapnel wound in a Maryland cornfield. 2,000 years apart. An ocean apart. Different languages, different weapons, different gods. And yet, the substance in their hands is identical, down to the smell of it, down to the color of the stain it leaves on the skin. The same green paste, the same plant, the same purpose. If you could set those two men in the same room, neither would need a translator to understand what the other was doing. The continuity is unbroken, and it is staggering when you really look at it. And here is the part that should make you sit up. This was not a desperate improvisation forced on the South by the blockade alone. Yarrow was not some fringe remedy that armies turned to only when the real medicine ran out. It was, by every measure of the time, real medicine. Widen the lens beyond the war, beyond one struggling army, and you find Yarrow written into the official record on both sides of the Atlantic. It appears in the U.S. and British pharmacopoeias into the late 19th century. These were the authoritative reference books of mainstream medicine, the catalogs that defined what a legitimate, recognized drug actually was. To be listed in them was to be approved by the medical establishment itself. Yarrow was in there, alongside the compounds every trained physician of the era trusted, which means it was a staple, a standard inclusion in the surgical kit, carried not because tradition demanded it, but because the medicine of the day formally endorsed it. Doctors in London and Boston and Philadelphia, men with diplomas and microscopes, men with no connection to any battlefield, recognized this plant as a tool of their trade. The records show it worked, and the records were not hidden in some obscure soldier's diary. They were printed in the foundational texts of Western medicine. So by the close of the 19th century, Yarrow stands at the height of its long career, endorsed by emperors and surgeons general, proven across 2 millennia, and confirmed in the official pharmacopoeias of the modern world. It is everywhere it should be, trusted by everyone who should trust it. And then it vanishes. Somewhere between roughly 1880 and the 1940s, the surgical kits quietly dropped it. The standard tool that had outlasted empires simply slipped out of the formulary, out of the chest, out of the surgeon's reach. And almost no one wrote down why. So here is the mystery laid plainly on the table. A remedy carried from the walls of Troy to the blood-soaked fields of Antietam, listed in official army manuals, printed in the pharmacopoeias of 2 empires. And then, in the span of a few short decades, it simply vanishes from the surgical kit. The thread that ran unbroken for 2,000 years goes quiet. Now, this is the moment where the easy story wants to take over. The obvious answer. The villain in the boardroom who buried the cure to sell something more profitable. It is a satisfying story. It is also, mostly, wrong. And the honest answer is far more interesting than any conspiracy, because no one had to suppress Yarrow. The world simply changed around it, and it was left behind. Consider the first force. In the late 19th century, a surgeon named Joseph Lister transformed the operating theater. Before Lister, more men died from infection after surgery than from the wounds themselves. He introduced antiseptic technique, and then the discipline grew into something stricter still, aseptic surgery, the practice of keeping the entire surgical field free of contamination from the very start. Sterilized instruments, boiled dressings, carbolic acid in the air. And in that new world of obsessive cleanliness, picture what Yarrow actually is. A wild plant, pulled from a roadside ditch, carrying soil and pollen and whatever microbes lived on its leaves. The same green paste that saved a legionary's life had, almost overnight, become exactly the thing the modern operating theater was built to keep out. A raw, unsterilized field plant was no longer medicine. It was a contamination risk no surgeon would accept. Now the second force. As Lister was reshaping the surgery, chemistry was reshaping the medicine. This was the age of the pharmaceutical revolution. For the first time, compounds could be purified, isolated down to a single active molecule, and produced in a precise, dose-standardized form. A doctor could now know exactly how much of a drug sat in a tablet, every dose identical to the last. And here, Yarrow simply could not compete. Its potency varied, from plant to plant, from one patch of soil to the next, from a dry summer to a wet one. The achilline that helped the blood clot was present in different amounts depending on where the plant grew and when it was picked. Against a purified, predictable, dose-standardized compound, a roadside weed of uncertain strength looked like a relic. Useful, perhaps, but unreliable in an age that had begun to worship reliability. Then came the proving ground that settled it, the World Wars. In the trenches and the field hospitals of the 20th century, military medicine was pushed harder and faster than ever before. And it answered with manufactured clotting agents, and by the Second Great War, with antibiotics, drugs that could stop an infection that Yarrow could only ever have hoped to slow. These were not folk remedies. They were industrial products, made to a specification, delivered by the crate to every front. They offered something variable Wild Yarrow could never guarantee, the same result every single time in the hands of any medic. When you can ship reliability in a box, the herb in the ditch stops looking like an answer. But all of that, the sterility, the chemistry, the war, only explains why Yarrow lost its advantage. It does not fully explain why it disappeared so completely, why no one even bothered to test whether the old records were right. For that, you have to follow the money. And here we reach the force that truly orphaned the plant. A plant cannot be patented. You cannot own Yarrow. It grows free in every ditch and meadow across the northern hemisphere, and anyone can pick it. So no company could ever hold an exclusive right to sell it, which means no company had any reason to spend a fortune funding the clinical trials that would have kept it in the formulary, that official list of approved drugs a hospital actually stocks and a surgeon actually reaches for. The patentable compound had a sponsor. The free weed had none. And so the consequence wrote itself. Every incentive, every dollar of research, every marketing campaign, every shelf in the supply room flowed toward the synthetic drugs that could be owned, branded, and sold. The financial current ran one direction, and only one direction. It funded the stockpiling of manufactured medicine, crate upon crate of standardized product, the inventory that quietly filled the modern medicine cabinet and the hospital pharmacy. There was no money in the weed, so the weed was forgotten. Not banned, not buried, just left out of the catalog that money builds. Which brings us to the verdict, and it is worth saying clearly because it is the whole point. Yarrow was never disproven. There is no study, no trial, no record anywhere showing that it failed to do what soldiers swore it did. It was not beaten in a fair fight. It was edged out by sterility, by standardization, and by money. Orphaned by progress in economics, not by evidence. The records still show it worked. We simply stopped reading them. And here is the quiet irony in all of it. The plant did not go anywhere. Yarrow still grows today, feathery and pale and stubborn, in the ditches and the verges and the untended corners, including, if you went and looked, the strips of waste ground beside the very hospitals that no longer remember it. It is still out there, the same plant, the same green paste a Roman field surgeon and a Confederate medic would both recognize on sight, growing within walking distance of the buildings that orphaned it. And only now, in our own time, have the laboratories begun to turn back. Modern researchers have started re-examining Yarrow's hemostatic compounds, the very molecules that slow bleeding and help a wound to clot. And what they are finding, under the microscope and in the assay, is confirmation. The clotting effect is real. The thing those legionaries staked their lives on, the thing they pressed into open wounds at Troy and Chickamauga, holds up. The plant never stopped working. We just stopped remembering why we ever trusted it.